Hey, I'm Taz from Fantasy Value Blog. Welcome to our first ever video. Right off the bat, I want to let you guys know that this video is directed towards managers who realize that their teams will make the playoffs and have a substantial lead in their respective leagues. This video is not for teams still struggling to make the playoffs. What I'm trying to do is give you guys a competitive edge in the playoffs. This year we have a shortened NBA season, and we're already in week 9 of 12, which means that ups 13 and 14, which are only 3 weeks away, will be the playoffs. You could have the perfect season and lead your league the entire year, but one loss in the playoffs and it could be all over. So you either sweep the matchups in the playoffs, or one loss and you're done. Now, you may ask, Taz, how exactly are you going to give us the competitive advantage in our leagues? Well, it's pretty simple. If you play fantasy sports, you may realize that teams who have the most number of players playing usually have an advantage. In football, you can see that in bye weeks, when a team has a lot of players with a bye week, they don't perform as well as their opponent. In fantasy basketball this year, because of the shortened season, there's a lot of action packed into a limited amount of time. So what you probably have seen this year is that your opponent could have 5 or 6 games more than you, or vice versa. And what people have been doing this year are using waiver wires, pick and drop strategy more than usual to make up for that. However, in the playoffs, you don't really want to depend on the waiver wire to make up for the differential between the number of games you're playing against your opponent. You always want to play more games in a matchup than your opponent. You always want to play more games in a matchup than your opponent. You always want to play more games in a matchup than your opponent. Let's get one thing straight. You always want your players to play more number of games than your opponent. So what I did was I went through each and every team in the NBA, and I compiled data which illustrates the number of games each NBA team plays during the last few weeks of the NBA season. The last 4 to 5 weeks of the NBA season make up the playoffs for most fantasy basketball leagues. For example, on ESPN, matchup 1 in the playoffs runs from March 26th to April 8th, while matchup 2, which would be the finals, runs from April 9th to April 26th. You can read all the data in the YouTube description box below or at the Fantasy Value blog. Remember, every team is different and you must accommodate your team. It's already been established you don't want teams that don't play a lot of games during matchup 1 and matchup 2 during the playoffs. Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Minnesota and New Jersey all play 16 games, alright? Now, the breakdown of matchup 1 and matchup 2 is very important. During matchup 1, teams play between 7 to 9 games. During matchup 2, teams play between 8 to 12 games. Now, you might say, what's the difference? 8 to 12 games? That's only a difference of 4 games. What's the big deal? Let's look at Chicago and Cleveland, for example. Chicago plays 9 games during matchup 2, and Cleveland plays 12. Now, you might say, what's the big deal? That's only a difference of 3 games. However, if you have 2 players on Cleveland, and your opponent has 2 players on Chicago, now that becomes a difference of 6 games. 6 games can equate for a difference of at least 60 points, perhaps 30 assists, 60 rebounds, etc., depending on who you have compared to your opponent. I have 2 players on New Jersey. I have Darren Williams and Brook Lopez. If my point guard is playing 3 games less than my opponent's point guard, that's a difference of almost 24 assists. Examples of teams that play a lot of games during the last 2 matchups are Charlotte and Cleveland, which play a total of 20. After that, you have Golden State, Indiana, Memphis, Miami, Sacramento, and San Antonio that all play 19 games. During matchup 2, Charlotte and Cleveland, as well as San Antonio, play 12 games. We'll get to San Antonio a little bit later. Let's look at Indiana, for example. Indiana is really interesting because Indiana is the only team, aside from Sacramento that play 9 games during matchup 1. Even though San Antonio plays 19 games, it's important to note that during matchup 1, they play 7. Now that you can somewhat see their future, as in you know the exact number of games every NBA player will play in fantasy basketball during the playoffs, what you can do is trade players from Atlanta or New Jersey, teams that aren't going to play a lot of games during the fantasy playoffs, to your opponents. You can trade your players to the opponent, and what you're trying to do is trade away your players that aren't going to play a lot of games to your opponents that will play a lot of games. That's how you'll get the advantage, because you're looking forward already. You might lose a little value in the trades, but the amount of games that you will gain in hand will give you the edge. That's it. Thank you for your time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, please post it below in the YouTube comments or at the Fantasy Value blog. That's it.